Hello, happy Easter to all of you. These will be the readings, a little bit of a commentary, and maybe even squeeze in a little bit of a homily for the Easter Vigil. This year, that's on April 20th, 2019. As I always stress in my commentaries, I presume that our parishes will have all 9 readings on the Easter Vigil. But because I only have limited space to comment on these readings, I've only chosen 4 of them for this particular commentary, at least, which is here. Just a very brief thing. I presume, following the early Christian practice, that everybody in the community shows up at the Easter Vigil. If somebody didn't show up for that Easter Vigil, I would presume the local pastor would be around the next day wanting to know why they had basically apostatized, why they had given up their faith. I find it interesting today because very few parishes emphasize that importance of the Easter Vigil. Big thing for the next day, certainly, hunting for eggs for the kids, and we always did that at Reno and enjoyed ourselves very much. But the Easter day itself is not necessarily the big celebration of Jesus' resurrection. That celebration is the night before and the vigil of that, during itself, the Easter Vigil itself. I would think after being a priest for 55 years that I would have made some indent in people's celebration of the Easter Vigil. I probably did in some people's lives, but certainly wasn't able to do it in a whole parish life, certainly. Never was able to pull it off, and if you go to your local parishes for the Easter Vigil, I suspect you will have a lot of empty spaces. I grew up, like most of you who are my age and more, with the Easter Vigil being celebrated on Holy Saturday morning, and we servers were trained to go in shifts and serve the priest, doing all sorts of strange things in Latin. That changed even before Vatican II. Pius XII changed that, and once again turned it to a vigil, and the first couple of years seemed to be quite very well celebrated. But as happened when people has not received proper, catechesis about it, people began to forget it and just said, oh, I'll just go the next morning and forget it. But it is the night in which Jesus rises from the dead. And when we're talking about this, we have to look especially at the readings that are here. These readings, as I'll mention later in the commentary, are ways somehow or another of trying to understand the implications of Jesus' resurrection. These are things in which, for instance, the early Christians said, with Jesus rising from the dead, it reminds me of, for instance. And the first reading that I treated was from Genesis 22, the famous sacrifice of Isaac. It reminded Christians of that. And so this will be Genesis 22. God put Abraham to the test. He called to him, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son Isaac, your only one whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. There you shall offer him up as a holocaust on a height that I will point out to you. Early the next morning, Abraham saddled his donkey, took with him his son Isaac and 2 of his servants as well, and with the wood that he had cut for the holocaust, set out for the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham got sight of the place from afar. Then he said to his servants, both of you stay here with the donkey while the boy and I go over yonder. We will worship and then come back to you. Thereupon Abraham took the wood for the holocaust and laid it on his son Isaac's shoulders, while he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 walked on together, Isaac spoke to his father Abraham. Father, Isaac said. Yes, son, he replied. Isaac continued, here are the fire and the wood, but where is the sheep for the holocaust? Son, Abraham answered, God himself will provide the sheep for the holocaust. Then the 2 continued going forward. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. Next he tied up his son Isaac and put him on top of the wood on the altar. Then he reached out and took the knife to slaughter his son. But Yahweh's messenger called to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he answered. "Do not lay your hand on the boy," said the messenger. "Do not do the least thing to him. I know now how devoted you are to God, since you did not withhold from me your own beloved son." So Abraham looked about. He spied a ram caught by its horns in the thicket. So he went and took the ram and offered it up as a holocaust in place of his son. Abraham named the site Yahweh Yireh. Hence people now say, "On the mountain Yahweh will see." Again Yahweh's messenger called to Abraham from heaven and said, "I swear by myself, says Yahweh, that because you acted as you did in not withholding from me your beloved son, I will bless you abundantly and make your descendants as countless as the stars of the sky and the sands of the seashore. Your descendants shall take possession of the gates of their enemies, and in your descendants all the nations of the earth shall find blessing. All this because you obeyed my command." By the way, just a little brief comment here. That has that famous line about the stars of heaven and the sands of the seashore. There was some sort of a study done several years ago which said there actually are more stars in the heaven than there are sands in the seashore. Very interesting. I would never have thought that was possible. The second reading that I've chosen is the one that has to be read on this night, even if you let a whole bunch of the other ones go by the wayside. And that is the famous reading from Exodus 14, the crossing of the sea. That, more than anything, was the reading that early Christians latched on to somehow or another explain their experience of Jesus' resurrection. Yahweh said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to go forward. And you lift up your staff and with hand outstretched over the sea, split the sea in two, that the Israelites may pass through it on dry land. But I will make the Egyptians so obstinate that they will go in after them. Then I will receive glory through Pharaoh and all his army, his chariots and his charioteers. The Egyptians shall know that I am Yahweh, when I receive glory through Pharaoh and his chariots and charioteers." The angel of God, who had been leading Israel's camp, now moved and went around behind them. The column of cloud also, leaving the front, took its place behind them, so that it came between the camp of the Egyptians and that of Israel. But the cloud now became dark, and thus the night passed, without the rival camps coming any closer together all night long. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and Yahweh swept the sea with a strong east wind throughout the night, and so it turned it into dry land. When the water was thus divided, the Israelites marched into the midst of the sea on dry land, with the water like a wall to their right and to their left. The Egyptians followed in pursuit. All Pharaoh's horses and chariots and charioteers went after them, right into the midst of the sea. In the night watch just before dawn, Yahweh cast through the column of the fiery cloud upon the Egyptian force a glance that threw it into a panic. And so he clogged their chariot wheels so that they could hardly drive. With that, the Egyptians sounded the retreat before Israel, because Yahweh was fighting for them against the Egyptians. Then Yahweh told Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the water may flow back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots and their charioteers." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at dawn the sea flowed back to its normal depth. The Egyptians were fleeing head-on toward the sea when Yahweh hurled them into its midst. As the water flowed back, it covered the chariots and the charioteers of Pharaoh's whole army, which had followed the Egyptians into the sea. Not a single one of them escaped. But the Israelites had marched on dry land through the midst of the sea, with the water like a wall to their right and to their left. Thus Yahweh saved Israel on that day from the power of the Egyptians. When Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the seashore, and beheld the great power that Yahweh had shown against the Egyptians, they feared Yahweh and believed in him and in his servant Moses. Then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to Yahweh. I will sing to Yahweh, for he is gloriously triumphant. Horse and chariot he has cast into the sea. The word of the Lord. By the way, if you're ever in a trivia exam or contest and somebody asks you what are the oldest words in the Bible, in the Hebrew Scriptures, I just read them. That line that says, I will sing to Yahweh, for he is gloriously triumphant. Horse and chariot he has cast into the sea. Scholars are pretty well unanimous in saying those are the oldest words in the Bible. They predate anything else we have in the Hebrew Scriptures. The third reading that I chose is the very well-known one, at least to me, from Deutero-Isaiah chapter 55. And his disciples, obviously Deutero-Isaiah didn't pick out the readings that would be used in the book that we refer to as Deutero-Isaiah. Deutero-Isaiah's disciples picked him out. And this was a way to summarize what that particular prophet meant in their life, and especially what the message was that revolved around that prophet's prophecies. Thus says Yahweh, all you who are thirsty, come to the water. You who have no money, come, receive grain and eat. Come without paying and without cost, drink wine and milk. Why spend your money for what is not bread, your wages for what fails to satisfy? Heed me, and you shall eat well. You shall delight in rich fare. Come to me heedfully, listen that you may have life. I will renew with you the everlasting covenant, the benefits assured to David. As I made him a witness to the peoples, a leader and commander of nations, so shall you summon a nation you knew not, and nations that knew you not shall run to you. Because of Yahweh your God, the Holy One of Israel, who has glorified you. Seek Yahweh while he may be found. Call him while he is near. Let the scoundrel forsake his way and the wicked man his thoughts. Let him turn to Yahweh for mercy, to our God who is generous and forgiving. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, says Yahweh. As high as the heavens are above the earth, so high are my ways above your ways, and my thoughts above your thoughts. For just as from the heavens the rain and snow come down, and do not return there till they have watered the earth, making it fertile and fruitful, giving seed to the one who sows and bread to the one who eats, so shall my word be that goes forth from my mouth. My word shall not return to me void, but shall do my will, achieving the end for which I sent it. The word of the Lord. And this year we are having the gospel reading from Luke that talks about Jesus basically appearing to the disciples after the resurrection and the discovery of that tomb, by the empty tomb, by the women. At daybreak on the first day of the week, the women who had come from Galilee with Jesus took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were puzzling over this, behold, two men in dazzling garments appeared to them. They were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground. They said to them, "Why do you seek the living one among the dead? He is not here, but he has been raised. Remember what he said to you while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners, be crucified, and rise on the third day." And they remembered his words. Then they returned from the tomb and announced all these things to the 11 and to all the others. The women, who were Mary Magdalene, Johanna, and Mary, the mother of James, the others who accompanied them, also told this to the apostles. But their story seemed like nonsense, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb. bent down and saw the burial cloths alone. Then he went home amazed at what had happened. The Gospel of the Lord. I always remind my students, if you base your belief in Jesus' resurrection on the 4 accounts of the discovery of the empty tomb in the 4 Gospels, you're in trouble. Remember Bishop Pike, the former Catholic who became a rather well-known Anglican bishop, declared in the early 60s, I guess, that he had lost his faith in Jesus. And he had lost his faith basically because he sat down and did what I always encourage people to do, to read all 4 accounts of the discovery of the empty tomb in one sitting. After he read them, he said, I don't know how anybody would believe that actually happened. Look at all the contradictions in there. And they're right. There's a lot of contradictions. For instance, there are 2 angels in Luke's account. Only Luke has 2 angels. He must have went to God's Rent an Angel agency that day, and there was buy one, get one free or something, so he ended up with 2 angels. But it totally contradicts what's in the other ones. But we have to realize that the authors of our scriptures were not interested in proving Jesus' resurrection, but were interested in showing the implications of that resurrection. What does it mean in your life for Jesus to have risen from the dead? And so anybody who originally, at least, read these accounts were people who had faith in Jesus' resurrection. They didn't read them just to find out the facts of the event. They read them to help understand what the meaning of that is. Throughout their lives, if Jesus rises from the dead, what does that mean for me? That's why, for instance, one of the things that's stressed in that Deutero-Isaiah reading that I just proclaimed is the very fact that Yahweh's word is behind all of our faith. That prophet only had Yahweh's word to go on. He's telling people we're going to end the Babylonian exile, we're going to go home to Jerusalem again, we're going to rebuild the country. And when people would say, how do you know that? He said it in this particular reading I just proclaimed. I can say it because Yahweh said so. Always reminds me of that scene in that old movie, Oh God, with John Denver, where John Denver asks God, well, how do I know you're really God? How do I proclaim the message that you give me to all these people you send me to? And God looks at him and says, oh, I forgot. Here, he says, and hands John Denver his calling card. And all it said on the calling card is God. In a sense, Deutero-Isaiah said that 2,500 years before John Denver. Deutero-Isaiah said that when he announced what Yahweh proclaimed to the people in exile. How do you know it's there? Here's his calling card. It says God. And God said it. That's why that beautiful end of this reading that I proclaimed is so significant, where it says, you know, God's word is kind of like the rain and the snow. When the rain and snow come down, it's going to eventually have an effect. Even though you don't notice it right then and there, it will have that effect. That's what God's word is all about. In a sense, that's also what Christians who follow Jesus' resurrection constantly go back to. Obviously, Yahweh is close to us, as Deutero-Isaiah said. Yahweh is far away from us at the same time. But when we look carefully at God in our life, it's God in that life that makes all the difference. We can come up with lots of different implications. I imagine on Easter Sunday, different preachers will bring up implications of Jesus' resurrection that aren't in the 4 Gospels or Paul's letter. More power to him. Although Luke has something in tonight's Gospel that's very significant. It's unique to Luke. When Luke's angels talk about Jesus has risen from the dead, they say something that is very significant. He had to die. Had to die. It was necessary. He uses the Greek word dei, D-E-I, which means you can't get around it, you got to do it. And so anybody who preaches on this night must go back to Luke's idea, you have to do it. We have a lot of preachers around preaching those prosperity gospels and nonsense like that, I'm afraid Luke would probably grab him by the necktie and say, bring up the die, okay? Bring up the have to when it comes to dying. As I said in the commentary, there are a lot of implications to Jesus' resurrection, especially on this night. What does it mean to have new life in our lives? But there's nothing that would question the have to when it comes to dying. We all have to die. If we don't die, this night isn't going to mean anything. And by the way, if Jesus doesn't die, neither does he rises from the dead. And if that's the case, neither do we rise from the dead. Have a happy Easter. Enjoy yourself. And I hope the kids enjoy hunting for the eggs. Goodbye.